3, 2, 1, go!
The plus control pad on the A button on the the A button on the gamepad, the 1 button on the Wii remote, the X button on the gamepad. Any player, the 2 button on any player, the B button on any player, the plus any player, the L button on any player, the X button on the gamepad. Any player, the any player, the B button on the gamepad, any player, the B any player, the R any player, the A button on the gamepad. Any player, the X button any player, the Y button on the gamepad, any player, the A button any player, the X any player, the X button on the gamepad, any player, any player, any player, the A button on the any player, the X any player, the cross control pad on the Wii remote. Any player, the 2 button on the Wii remote, any player, the A button any player, any player, the Y button on the gamepad. Any player, the 2 button on any player, the F any player, the plus any player, the X button any player, the A button on the Wii remote. Any player, the any player, the plus any player, the Y button on the game, any player, the R any player, the Y button on the gamepad. Any player, the R any player, the any player, the A button any player, the plus any player, the B button on the gamepad. Any player, the Y button on any player, the X any player, the R button on any player, the B button on the any player, the A button on the gamepad. Any player, the cross control pad on the any player, the A button any player, the A button on the gamepad, any player, the Y button on the game, any player, the cross control pad any player, the X button on any player, the B button on the gamepad. Any player, the L any player, the any player, the cross control pad on the Wii remote. Any player, the Y button any player, the cross any player, the A button on the any player, the L button any player, the R button on the gamepad. Any player, the plus control any player, the 1 button on the Wii remote, any player, the A button on the gamepad, any player, any player, the 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player, the R any player, the plus control pad on the Wii remote, any player, the A button on the gamepad. Any player, the A button on any player, the X any player, the plus control pad on the Wii remote. Any player, the plus any player, the any player, the B button on the any player, the R button on the any player, the A button on the gamepad. Any player, the X button on the any player, the plus any player, the B button any player, the 1 button on the any player, the A button on the Wii remote. Any player, the X button on any player, the plus control pad on any player, the X button any player, the any player, the R button on the gamepad. Any player, the A button any player, the A any player, the plus any player, the 1 button on the any player, the L button on the gamepad. Any player, the R button any player, the 2 button any player, the Y button on the any player, the L button on the gamepad. Any player, the Y button on the any player, the plus control pad on any player, the plus any player, the 2 button on the Wii any player, the 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player, the R any player, the A button any player, the 1 button any player, the plus any player, the 2 button on the Wii remote. Any player, the 2 button any player, the 1 any player, the any player, the A button on any player, the 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player, the any player, the L button any player, the X button on the gamepad any player, the B button any player, the A button on the Wii remote. Any player, the 1 button on any player, the X button any player, the F any player, the R button on the gamepad, any player, the X button on the gamepad. Any player, the L any player, the A button on any player, the R button any player, the L button on the gamepad. Any player, the any player, the A button any player, the 2 button on the any player, the A button on the gamepad. Any player, the B button on the any player, the A button any player, the R any player, the B button on the gamepad. Any player. The R button. Any player. The T button on the any player. The X button on the any player. Any player. The X button on the gamepad. Any player. The plus control pad on the game. Any player. Any player. The A button. Any player. The A button. Any player. The X button on the gamepad. Any player. The X button. Any player. The R button on the any player. The plus control pad on the any player. Any player. The T button on the Wii remote. Any player. The any player. The A button on the game. Any player. The A any player. The T button on any player. The R button on the gamepad. Any player. The plus control pad. Any player. The X button. Any player. Any player. The L button on any player. The L button on the gamepad. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The A button. Any player. The B button on any player. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The 1 button. Any player. The plus. Any player. The R button. Any player. The Y button. Any player. The X button on the gamepad. Any player. The plus control pad on any player. The R any player. The L any player. The Y button. Any player. The A button on the gamepad. Any player. The 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player. The X button. Any player. The A any player. The L button on the game. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The any player. Any player. The any player. Any player. The L button on the gamepad. Any player. The X. Any player. The T button on any player. The A any player. The A button. Any player. The plus control pad on the Wii remote. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The Y button. Any player. The T button on the Wii remote. Any player. The L button. Any player. The Y button on the gamepad. Any player. The Y. Any player. The any player. The Y. Any player. The A. Any player. The A button on the gamepad. Any player. The 1 button on the Wii. Any player. The any player. The X. Any player. Any player. The B button on the gamepad. Any player. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The 1 button on the Wii. Any player. The plus control pad on the Wii. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The Y button on any player. The R button on any player. The plus control. Any player. The Y button on the any player. The B button on the gamepad. Any player. The B button. Any player. The 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player. The Y button. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The B button. Any player. The R button. Any player. The 1 button. Any player. The X. Any player. The 1 button on the Wii remote. Any player. The X button. Any player. The A button on any player. The 1 button on the any player. The X button on the game. Any player. The A button on the gamepad. Any player. The R button. Any player. The B button on any player. The 1 button on the Wii. Any player. The R. Any player. The plus control pad on the Wii remote. Any player. The plus control pad on the any player. Any player. The plus any player. The B button on the any player. The A button on the gamepad. Any player. The A button. Any player. The X. Any player. Any player. The B button. Any player. The B button on the gamepad. Any player. The B button on any player. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The B button. Any player. The R button on the gamepad. Any player. The A button. Any player. The L button. Any player. The L. Any player. The R button. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The X button on any player. Any player. Any player. The R button. Any player. The A button on the Wii remote. Any player. The B button on the any player. The R button. Any player. The X button. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The X button on the gamepad. Any player. Any player. Any player. Any player. Any player. The B button on the gamepad. Any player. Any player. The plus. Any player. The A button on any player. The L button. Any player. The L button on the gamepad. Any player. The plus control. Any player. The A button on the any player. The L button on the any player. The A button. Any player. The plus control pad on the Wii remote. Any player. The B button. Any player. The plus. Any player. The X. Any player. The L button on the game. Any player. The R button on the gamepad. Any player. The L button.